Because the thing about AI is that it learns, it adapts, and it acts. And then it learns, adapts, and acts. And this is a virtuous cycle. So the problem that we have as an organization is if we stand back and allow that to happen, suddenly the organization is making decisions it doesn't understand.
With me today is Tony Moroney, a thought leader in digital leadership and author of the Digital Explorer Chronicles, a regular newsletter series looking at how AI, digital technology, and organizational change shape enterprise strategy, leadership, and governance. Tony, welcome to the pod.
Iain, delighted to be here.
I gave a brief overview there of yourself, but why don't you start with introducing yourself and giving an overview of what you do and who you are?
Okay, so Iain, I have been, I suppose I started my career in financial services, believe it or not. But for the last 16 years or so, I have been involved in international management consulting. So working with firms all over the world, the boards, the exec teams in terms of digital disruption, what does it mean in terms of organization, how strategy should change, how culture should be adopted, and how organizations, start to become what they need to be successful in the future.
Very good. And I mentioned you have a regular newsletter series called the Digital Explorer Chronicles. Is that correct? And if so, what is it about? Who's it for? What does it cover?
So it's something I decided to do because what I was discovering with boards and executives was that when they thought of digital disruption or AI, they tended to think about it through a technology lens. Whereas, it's not really about the technology. The technology is an enabler. But what we really need to think about is, how do we organize? What does it mean for the future of our business in terms of how it should work? What sort of capabilities it's going to require? How the governance should work? So what I do is I write on a weekly basis, exploring the evolving issues. It's kind of like if you take the arc of AI, because look, AI is not new. It's been around for longer than I have, but in the last 3 years, it has come into vogue. But really it's around exploring that arc because firms have they've gone through the experimentation into now the pilots, and now they're asking, well, where's the value? But increasingly they're also asking, well, how do we actually govern this, and how do we make sure that we're doing what we think we're doing, or that we're achieving the type of results that we're happy to achieve?
And in those 16 years, if you were to look back through all the various digital transformation and changes that the industry's gone through from a tech point, what would be some of the major ones that the industry's faced?
Well, look, I can answer this question from my experience all around the world, and what I would say to you is, look, digital transformation in the main has failed to achieve its objectives, and part of the reason is because firms think of digital transformation as a technology issue, and in fact, I would argue that the biggest problem with digital transformation is the word digital because it immediately frames it as a technology issue, whereas really this is around transformation. Because look, our businesses were built in a particular way. They were successful at a point in time, but that world no longer exists. So really it's around transformation, and that starts with mindset, because if we don't think differently about the business, we don't act differently in the business. And if we don't act differently, the culture stays exactly as it is. And this is where disruption comes about, because someone else comes along and they say, well, why do they do that? That's not what customers are looking for. We can create a much better experience, give the customers what they need and make it enjoyable. So I think, technology, it's a fantastic enabler, but it's a means to an end, not an end in its own right. And I think too many organizations are fixated on, let's overlay this technology into the organization. And the result is, look, I'm sure you've seen it yourself. I've seen loads of organizations where, they've implemented systems, but nothing changes. But they never set out to transform the organization. All they set out to do was introduce a new technology. And we're humans, so when we see new technologies, we don't exactly respond with joy most of the time, because it disrupts how we think. But over a period of time, what we need to do is we need to assimilate and understand, well, okay, the technology, actually, this is kind of interesting what it could do here. And then we start to evolve it, and then it starts to become second nature. But the problem is that if we're just relentlessly focused on implementing technologies, we never get there. And resistance grows internally, and people don't engage, and the culture fragments around silos and everything else, because transformation is an enterprise-wide thing. It's not let's transform part of the organization. No, this is transform the whole organization. Let's transform how we think about the business. Let's transform the culture, and let's transform the outcomes. And that's very different than how most organizations are structured, because over time, as they grew, they built silos, and those silos are specialists in their own right. But now it's, throwing parcels over the wall, and we're not thinking end to end in terms of what it is we're trying to do, or in fact, why we even exist. So while there's a lot of talk about purpose, it doesn't actually play out in terms of how we think about transformation.
Okay, so if I was to take the key message there is most are starting with technology when they should be focusing on how they're going to do transformation properly from an organizational and cultural place. So if you were to do that from scratch and build a transformation program that is going to be successful, what are the ingredients in that?
So it starts with understanding why the firm exists in the first place. So, why do we exist? And it's not usually around things like technology, because we don't transform because of technology. We have a market where we serve customers and we meet their needs. So what we need to understand, though, is, well, if the world is evolving, and look, digital is everywhere. So if the business model has to evolve, what does it look like in the future if we want to be relevant and competitive? And then our next question is, okay, how could we get there from today? Because that's not about making the past better. We need to do that anyway. But really, it's around we're saying, well, look, here is where we are today, but actually the future looks very different. And there's a gap there. So how do we get there? And in that context, if we can answer that, we can then start to address things about, well, what do we need to do? And that includes technology. Well, what I see all over the world is we start with the what. Well, we need to have one of these. We need an AI. We need a blockchain. We need, yeah, but why do we need them? I mean, they might be very interesting. They might be very useful, but they're lacking context. So the organization needs to be clear on where it's going. It needs to figure out how does it get there. And in that context, then answer, okay, well, what are the things we need to do, including technology?
And does that then introduce or does it expose organizations that maybe go headfirst into AI, different pieces are firing off, but if they don't have a coherent strategy, that's going to expose the organization and their strategy overall? Or how would that work if people go headfirst into AI without that coherent strategy?
So I think this is a really interesting inflection point in business, because, heretofore a lot of our technology was kind of passive. You put it in, you told it what to do, whatever. Right? But we're now moving into a world where, AI is not passive. It actually, it's not about automating, processes. It's about automating decisions. And when I talk to organizations around the world, they're usually in the space of, well, we can drive automation and reduce costs, or we can increase compliance to this, that, and the other. And that's all true, but that's table stakes. Everyone will do that. Right? The real question is, well, if we think of your traditional organization, information flowed up, there was all these checkpoints, be they review committees or whatnot, and ultimately, leaders made decisions. Well, in an AI world, decision making will be instantaneous. And that means the decisions are compressed in terms of time. And the opportunity for leaders to intervene and guide decision making evaporates. So if we just deploy AI into our organizations and sit back and wait for the outcomes, the problem is we're no longer in control. Actually, what we're doing is we're storytelling based on what the outcomes appeared. And really what we need to be thinking about is, well, if AI is going to fundamentally change how an enterprise works, how are we going to govern for that? And how are we going to make sure that we are managing the behaviors of the technology and that we're managing the intent so that we know what type of outcomes will be driven? Because the thing about AI is that it is it learns, it adapts, and it acts. And then it learns, adapts, and acts. And this is a virtuous cycle. So the problem that we have as an organization is if we stand back and allow that to happen, suddenly the organization is making decisions it doesn't understand. And in fact, the decisions have been taken without any leadership involvement, perhaps. Right? And now, if that happens and you end up in a quagmire, you're going to spend months upon months trying to figure out what happened, because it won't be apparent. I mean, you've heard the stories about opaque AI. Well, the black box. Well, how did the decision get made? We don't know. Right? So you need to be very clear from the outset in terms of, if we introduce technology that can actually make decisions, what are the parameters in which we allow the machines to make decisions? And where is it that we want humans actually in total control? Not this human in the loop, humans in control. So where are the control points where we know that, yeah, okay, technology can make certain recommendations, but we know that within these boundaries, humans make the decisions. Otherwise, you're kind of hoping for the best. You're rolling the dice and you're assuming that AI will do what it's supposed to do. But the problem with all technologies is humans are biased, and therefore all those biases make their way into the technologies. And if the technology is biased, well, then your outcomes are going to be biased too. So we need to really think hard about, how we're going to use AI in the business to drive outcomes that we are happy to stand over. Because at the end of the day, financial services is about trust. And if you're going to introduce technology that can, accelerate and make decisions, well, how are you going to trust that? Because if you can't trust it, why would your customers?
If you're enjoying the Fund AI pod, the best way to support the show is simple: hit subscribe. It really helps a new channel like this grow, and it allows us to attract even more interesting guests from across the funds industry. Head to www.thefundaipod.com to catch past episodes, nominate future guests, or explore ways that we can work together, whether that's consulting, sponsorship, speaking, or collaboration. Now back to the episode. So you're starting to dive there into the importance of governance, auditability, explainability, transparency, etc. So that really speaks to designing a strong governance program before you deploy AI. Is that fair? And if so, what would be your advice to someone looking to set up AI and structure a governance program?
Yeah, no, that is absolutely right. Look, as I said, the technology is not passive. The problem is that a lot of our governance frameworks are static, right? So they measure, they go back kind of retrospectively and look at what happened. Well, maybe in a world where what happened was static too, but if your technology is moving faster than your ability to govern, your governance framework actually has a real problem. Because what AI does, so apart from automating decision making, it actually exposes all the fragilities of an organization. So if your data is poor, if your decision authority is poor, if your incentives are poorly aligned, AI amplifies those, right? So it's not that it's not that it's kind of, well, look, we weren't great and AI is just doing the same. No, it's amplifying that, and it's actually becoming faster and more proficient at doing all the things you're not good at. So we need to have the governance right, because if we don't have the governance right, and that means we need to look at, okay, well, what is our data architecture? Because we talk about being data driven, but in reality, data is not where it should be. Right? But AI is totally dependent on data. If your data is no good, your AI is going to be suboptimal at best. Do we understand how decisions get made in an organization and where those decisions actually might now be circumvented by technology? And if they are going to be circumvented, on what basis are we allowing that to happen? And does that start to actually dumb down the organization because we become more reliant on the technology, the algorithms? And if that happens, then, do we run a risk that actually we basically have abandoned our fiduciary responsibilities because we're relying on the algorithms? Now, if the algorithms get it wrong, the problem is you don't impact a handful of customers. You potentially impact all of your customers. And that's bad enough. But if you're in a regulated environment, like financial services, that's huge. That's a calamity. That's your trust out the window. That's, you're going to have regulators all over you. You're going to have the markets all over you because you have a real problem.
And if we double click into a comment you had there, and it's a theme you hear across the industry, that if you have bad data, AI will just amplify that. And you talked about AI or intelligent workflows exposing bad characteristics of an organization. So what would be, from your experience, some areas that do get exposed by AI when they're deployed? So, for example, you mentioned data is a good example, potentially AI literacy or education on this. But what if you do deploy this and your organization isn't ready? What sort of ways would this show up in the organization?
Well, I think, there's a lot of talk about AI pilots and everything at the moment and why the pilots are not working. And part of the issue is the pilots, they're interesting pilots, but they're in discrete parts of the business. We need to be thinking about end-to-end, enterprise-wide, right? Because that's the way AI operates. It doesn't operate in this corner here. It's looking at the whole thing. And if we don't have an enterprise-wide view of what we're trying to do and how decisions are made and how data flows and where that data comes from and the validity of that data, well, it's very hard to govern that, because we're now dealing with a patchwork of data, which may be okay, may not be okay. We're not quite sure who is making the decisions. And this becomes a really important point, because at the moment we're assuming from we got a board that delegates to senior leadership, that delegates down through management, etc. But if that dynamic changes and suddenly you have decisions being made and taken by AI in any part of the value chain, um, well, what does that mean in terms of how we're now governing? And how would we know? Like, how would we know who made the decision? Was this decision made by the executive, or was it made by AI, or was it a combination of both? And if so, who ultimately decided? And importantly, who ultimately is responsible? Because I wager you this, Ian, that in the years to come, we are going to see boards and exec teams, holding up their hands or saying, we didn't realize the technology did this. But as you and I know, in financial services, that is not an acceptable position. Right? If you want to deploy the technology into your organization, well, you need to understand what it does. You need to understand how it drives outcomes. You need to make sure that they are good outcomes, that they are fair, they are trustworthy, that they treat people with the type of respect that they need, but that you can stand over them. Right? Because if you can't explain what is happening, well, why are you doing it? And this is where conduct regulation comes in, because you're responsible for the outcome, not for what you did per se. But if you have a bad outcome, well, you should have known better, and you should have taken steps to make sure that you understood your AI and you understood where it impacted on decisions, what sort of outcomes it drove, what was the basis of those decisions, and was the intent right in the first place?
Now, to bring that to life, though, and you've mentioned this a few times, that there's the risk that AI cuts out the decision makers and makes the decision themselves. It also compresses that decision making because it's just running it automatically. So, what should an organization do then to address that? And by that, I mean, what are some practical advice? I would assume the first is, if you haven't documented the workflow as it exists today before you apply AI, do that. So you identify those decision points and key pieces. Then when you're deciding to offload a certain process to AI, what in practical terms do you need to do to address those concerns that you raised?
So look, if I take something, take something like the fund industry, you probably got, origination, you probably got, risk management, you probably got asset management, you got a whole source of range of different divisions. um, and the question that we need to be thinking about is end to end. What is happening in that? And where are all those decision points? And where are all the data points that support it? Right? And who is going to make those decisions? And which ones are we going to allow machines to be involved in? And if we allow them, on what basis are we allowing them? Which ones do we absolutely need to make sure that humans are making the decisions, not the machines? Because we can delegate everything except our responsibilities. Right? So we need to be looking end to end to understand exactly how this will play out in the organization, and also recognize, that look, for most organizations, the silos tend to dominate. The data also tends to be in silos as opposed to end to end. We need to be thinking totally different. We need to be thinking about, look, if we want our enterprise to be, a beneficial party to AI, we need to accept that AI is no longer a technology overlay. It is actually a decision maker within our organization. Therefore, it has agency. And if it has agency, we need to understand the basis of that agency and where it fits alongside human agency, and ultimately who is responsible. And I'm not sure, from what I'm seeing right across the globe, I'm not sure that organizations are thinking along the lines of agency and thinking of AI as a corporate partner that needs to be managed just like anyone else in the organization. And I'm not saying, the AI is human, but if we manage humans, we also need to manage AI, because it is a corporate partner with agency that can impact decisions and outcomes for our customers.
I agree in an extent, but if we think about, like you mentioned, all the conduct regimes, ultimately someone needs to be held responsible, and an AI can't. So, as you mentioned, you could use AI to maybe inform decisions and give your information, but ultimately you shouldn't fully delegate, or if you do, you're ultimately responsible. So you need to balance that responsibility, kind of like outsourcing, right? If you outsource to another location, they can do the work, but ultimately when it comes back onshore, like nav release, you on the onshore location are ultimately responsible for that outcome, that deliverable. So how do you do that with AI? Is that just about describing what it does within the process, how you've used it? If it's a critical decision, you shouldn't outsource it. It should just be an input, not a decision maker. Walk us through that.
Well, I think there's probably a couple of things to it. One is we need to understand autonomous decision making. So where will machines make decisions and why? Right? So we need to understand that. We need to make sure at all times that we have auditability and explainability. Right? So if something is happening, we know it's happening, right? But we can also explain why it's happening, right? Because you know acknowledging it happened is one thing, and being able to explain why it's happening is a totally different thing. So I think we need to be looking at the design architecture for an organization. So to understand exactly what is happening and to be able to demonstrate what is happening and to be able to explain what is happening. And like you mentioned outsourcing, and look, I do a lot of work with, CX transformation with firms all over the world. And, it is a fascinating area, but ultimately, if you're in an organization and you're going to use an outsourcer, it's incumbent on you to go see them and see what actually happens, right? And to see that what you think is happening is what really happens in your business. And it's the same with AI. If you're going to have AI in the business, well, you need to go and see what is happening. And if you can't audit and you can't explain, well, you don't know what is happening in the business. And therefore, you have actually abdicated your responsibilities. And that's not a good place to be. So it is around this, ongoing, continuous audit, continuous drive for explainability, and continuous enforcement of humans in control.
Now, if we were to pivot to the people side of an organization, they're obviously critical to the success of AI and the strategy of the organization. So, what advice would you have for leadership on ensuring that the human side of AI and the people within the organization are aligned and ready for this?
So, well, the first thing we need to do is we need to invest in fluency, digital fluency, AI fluency. Let's demystify what we're talking about here, because as humans, we don't relish the thoughts of new technology most of the time, unless it's something in our personal life. But we need to get people comfortable to understand the technology and what its role is, because a lot of the newspaper commentary and whatnot is AI is going to take away your job. Now I would argue no, it's not going to take away your job, but it's going to make you far more proficient if it's used the right way. So it should augment your own capabilities. So we need to get people in a place where they're actually understanding what the business needs to do, why it needs to change, how it needs to change, what's in it for them. Right? So we're going to give them new skills so that they can actually do these type of things. There is one area though that is particularly challenging. So if we take, any organization, your new recruits, they come in and they learn by doing, and they get things wrong and they learn, no, actually that's not how you do it. But they're small mistakes. Right? Well, in the future, those roles may not exist. Um, Whereas a lot of our management and future leaders, they come through this learning path, so they have all this tacit knowledge of the organization. They understand how it works. They understand what are the things that could go wrong, etc. Well, if all of those tasks can be automated, where are your future managers and leaders going to get their tacit knowledge of how things really work in the world? Right? Because if they don't have that, well, then now that starts to bring into question judgment. Because at the end of the day, a lot of things we do in business, require judgment, and that's based on an understanding of the business, its history, its customers, the regulatory environment, all those type of things. But also, there's a lot of nuances in our organization that they're not scripted. They're not in rule books. It's just how we operate. It's our culture. It's how we do things around here. So if AI takes away a lot of the learning curve, we need to be thinking about how are we going to train future managers and leaders to have that broad understanding of the organization so that they can exercise judgment at the times when it's really important. Because today, your manager, well, they've got their, 15 years of experience, and in that time, they got a few things wrong, and they learned from it, and they've had to, deal with audit and compliance and risk, and they understand, oh yeah, actually, I really understand why this is important. But if that learning is gone, how are you going to create these future leaders that can sort of, stand back and look at things and say, okay, well, I'm going to exercise my judgment here, and, based on my experience, here's what I'm going to recommend. So I think there's a challenge. So there's a twofold challenge. One is to get people comfortable that AI is not a threat. In fact, AI can make our lives far more, meaningful, because a lot of the drudgery can be gone, and we can actually contribute at a much higher level. But also to recognize that as it does all that, it actually takes away the learning path to future management, because we don't make the mistakes, and we don't have the learning and the scars to prove that we got it wrong and we've learned from it. So we need to be thinking about, okay, let's get it right for today, but also let's understand the context is going to change in terms of our future leadership. The other thing I'd say, Ian, is that, look, in your traditional organization, information flowed upwards. So came from every part of the organization up to the top team. In an AI world, intelligence is distributed, so expertise is no longer the bottleneck. The bottleneck, in fact, could become leadership. So we need to reframe leadership in terms of, managing intent, but also managing, decision-making authority throughout the organization, understanding where those decisions and the basis for those decisions, where they're happening, why they're happening, and making sure that at all times that they are good decisions. So it's not going to be a case of let the information flow up and, people at the top will make decisions. It'll happen in real time, and it'll happen in every part of the organization, because the intelligence will be there to do that.
And speaking of intelligence, AI is becoming significantly more intelligent. We're also seeing organizations, maybe on the smaller side, start to deploy agents and give them personas. They get their own emails, they get their own Slack accounts, and they have a specific role. They're a researcher, they're a communications, they're a HR bot. You spoke about this earlier about almost having agency. So, how should an organization embed them and think about this evolution of agents becoming part of the organization structure?
So I would say, look, we need to be thinking more like, probably a football manager or a rugby manager, because, we can deploy an agent in an organization, and yes, it'll perform certain duties. But actually, the real challenge is we're going to have multiple agents that will interact with each other and interact with humans. So now we have a whole bunch of agents that are doing things. So one might be looking at, market risk. One might be looking at compliance. One might be looking at data. One might be looking at whatever it might be. Right? These agents are working, semi-autonomously and working with each other. So now we need to be thinking about, okay, well, we used to have a striker, but now we have a striker, we have midfielders, defenders, goalkeepers, substitutes, etc. And how are we going to orchestrate that all works in a way that we understand and that we can actually stand over? Because the risk is that we have all these agents doing their own thing all over the place, and actually there's things going on between agents and we don't even have visibility of it. So we need to be thinking about, look, in the organization of the future, it's going to be about orchestrated intelligence. And that doesn't mean the leader has to have all the answers. It means they need to have the wisdom to be able to look at all the moving parts and to understand that actually we have humans and we have digital agents, and they are working together. And, these teams will be probably smarter than the leaders, right? Because humans satisfy, so they work on whatever information they have. They never have full information. AI is different. AI can have all the information that's available, period, and it can digest it and understand it and do things in real time. So we need to understand that if we're going to have an organization where intelligence is distributed and it is working in a way that humans and machines are doing things in real time, our job changes to actually how do we oversee all that, and how do we govern all that, and how do we manage for intent?
And the governance is key, especially as you think about financial services, which is highly regulated. And so, looking at that, given the risk environment, the regulatory environment, how should firms in financial services, fund management balance the ambition of what AI could unlock and deliver versus the control and risk associated with adopting AI?
Yeah, so look, the first thing I say is AI readiness, as in technology, is not the same as enterprise readiness. So, the AI is the easy part. So you can get ready from a technology perspective pretty easy. But we need to be actually thinking about how are we going to define the architecture before we do it, so that we know what's going to happen and that we can manage and govern what's going to happen. Because you can't put an AI into an organization and then say, well, we better think about governance. That's going to end up in tears. And we need to understand that, look, if we're going to bring any technology, be it AI or anything else in, what does that do to enterprise governance? And how do we get ahead of that? And how do we build in the safeguards up front? So let's get the guardrails or whatever we want to call them. How do we get them in up front so that as we start to deploy, we know what's happening? But take it even simpler. I mean, we already have had cases in the last 2-3 years where organizations have been held to account because the data they were using was biased. The outcomes were biased. But the problem was not just that the data was biased. The real problem was they actually didn't know what was happening. So we need to be thinking about this in terms of, let's understand what we're proposing to do. Let's understand what that means. Let's understand where we need guardrails, where we need to make sure humans are making the decisions. Let's understand what the machine algorithms might do and suggest. And let's make sure that, maybe there are certain things we're happy about, but let's make sure that anything that's critical or important, that actually that the machines are not just making the decisions.
Now, I want to combine a few topics. We discussed the people side, and you mentioned obviously one of the benefits of AI is it takes the mundane off, and that therefore frees up people to do the more value added, creative, enjoyable aspects of their job. Most firms, when they deploy AI, are going to look at those highly repeatable, automatable processes that they can get cost efficiencies from. When a firm's looking at an AI roadmap, and assuming they capture some of those low-hanging fruits, what should they be thinking about in terms of development to generate and create value for their organization?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is they need to redefine how they're going to create value in their organization, because our organizations work in a particular way because that's how they've always worked. And a great question I love asking boards and exec teams is, if you were starting again tomorrow, would you do it this way? And, I've yet to find any organization that says, yes, of course we would, right? Because we all know that our organizations are doing things that don't make any sense, or they're very cumbersome and clunky and whatnot. And certainly from a customer experience point of view, they're not great. So I would say is, if we think about how we're going to create value in the future, the opportunity is in this to redefine how the enterprise should work end to end. Because if we're just using, and this is what happened with digital transformation, we overlaid various technologies into organizations and became faster and more proficient at doing what customers actually didn't really want. I'm being slightly flippant, but we automated, we became faster, all those, the cheaper, whatnot. But we didn't stand back and sort of say, yeah, but should we be doing this at all? And there is a fundamental difference, because if we're looking at the world going forward and we say, well, okay, in the funds industry, for example, AI could do significant things. It totally changes the dynamic of investing. It totally changes the way of thinking about risk. It totally changes the dynamics of portfolios or what it might be. Right? So how do we define value in this world going forward? And how would we organize for that? And part of the issue, as I see it, is we tend to improve the past. And that's good. We should do that. And we're paid to do that. But we simultaneously need to sort of say, well, actually, what does this future look like? And that's based on a vision for the future. It's not based on where we come from. And that determines what we need to be thinking about, right? Because we now have very clear view of the world. And look, it's difficult to be 100% because look, everything keeps changing, but we need to have a view. I'm always reminded of the line in Alice in Wonderland where Alice asks the cat which road should she take, and the cat says, "Well, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there." And I feel a lot of organizations operate on that basis. I was with one organization there last year, and we talked about disruption. And at the end of it, they said to me, we should have had you in a few months ago because we just signed off on 2 major technology renewals without thinking about where we're going. And I would say, look, let's have a view in terms of what this business needs to look like in the future, and what would make it relevant, what would make it competitive, and figure out, okay, there's a big gap. There will be a gap for sure. And we need to be thinking about, okay, how are we going to close that? And that's your transformation. Anything else is kind of change management. And in my experience, Ian, a lot of firms do change management and call it transformation. It's not transformation.
So early on in the AI cycle, there was a lot of hype and people wanting to be seen to be deploying AI and calling it out when really it was maybe a small project, or AI washing as it's sometimes called. How do firms avoid the pitfall of AI washing and actually get real value out of AI?
So yeah, it is a very interesting area. And look, boards and exec teams feel under pressure to be seen to do something with AI because they can't pick up the Harvard Business Review or the Financial Times or whatever it might be. Everyone's talking about AI. So this feeling of we need to be seen to do something. But as I said earlier, Ian, look, part of the problem is pilots are great, but they don't transform the enterprise. And unless you're thinking about enterprise transformation, all you're going to have is interesting pilots. And AI washing, and it is a great term, it'll get you so far, but actually it's not going to do much in terms of fundamentally, rethinking your organization. Being interesting, there will be some learnings from it. And if you can, maybe take those learnings and sort of say, okay, but now let's think this at an enterprise and at scale. But if it's just pilots, they're just pilots. That's all they are. And they'll be interesting. You'll have pilots going on everywhere, but you won't have much transformation. So I would say, look, enterprise transformation end to end, and think about, okay, where can AI take our big enterprise, problems, and how could we use that to redefine value and to redefine how the organization works?
So, Tony, we covered a lot in this episode. If you were to have one takeaway message for the audience, what would that be?
I would say that, look, it's never about the technology. It's always about, the people and how we think about the business. I would say in terms of AI that, our challenge is that intelligence can scale faster than our ability to govern. And ultimately, financial services is based on trust. And if we're going to introduce technologies that could undermine that trust because, we don't do it in the right way, that would be a calamity. And I would say, look, if we're going to do these things, and of course we should do them, but let's do them right. Let's build the architecture. Let's build in the governance, and let's understand that AI is a means to an end. It's not an end in its own right.
So you're clearly an expert on AI, digitalization, and organizational change. Is there a particular book that you'd recommend that covers those topics?
Yeah, actually, well, I read a lot of books, but actually there was a great book there by Eric Schmidt, Genesis, Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit. Eric Schmidt is, he's doing the world tour ever since, but he is very good. And this book really gets behind, well, what is it we're trying to do and why are we trying to do it? And, where is humanity in all this? Because, if we think about AI doesn't have feelings. So it will just act based on what's in front of it. So unless we actually, have the intent right, we're not quite sure where we will end up with AI. I would say, look, that's a great read. I mean, obviously my newsletter is a read too, where on a weekly basis, we unpack these issues.
And where can our audience members follow your work, but also, as you mentioned, the Digital Digital Explorer Chronicles, your newsletter? Where can they find and follow that?
LinkedIn is probably the best. And in addition to the Chronicle, like I publish over 100 articles a year, mostly in the AI transformation disruption space. So there's plenty of material there.
Excellent. Well, Tony, I appreciate taking the time to come on the pod. Thank you.
Ian, thank you. I enjoyed it.